Good morning, everyone. My name is Gabriel Velez, and I'm an assistant professor in the College of Education at Marquette. And I'm going to be leading our panel today. And the title is Inequity in Higher Education Access and Success in the Age of COVID-19, Emerging Research and Collaborative Efforts to Bolster Outcomes for Black and Brown Students. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to be here for the UW Diversity Forum. And we look forward to hopefully engaging with you folks and talking about our different work and different questions in this area. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what we're going to do today in this next hour and 15 minutes, is we're going to start with some introductions of my fellow panelists. I'm just going to kind of mention who they are, what their background and institutions are a little bit, what their work is. Then we're going to start with two questions for them, and we're going to start with one and have them each respond and offer some thoughts, and then a second question. And then we're going to kind of open that up to a discussion among panelists, just sort of a free-flowing open discussion based on that. And then we're going to take audience questions, and then we're going to sort of answer them and try and continue to build on the conversation in that way. So I am joined today by a number of colleagues across different institutions, and I'm really honored to be a part of this. I will start by sort of mentioning in order from Alberto Maldonado, and he is the director of the Berto Hernandez Center at UWM. We also have joining us Brian Troyer, who's the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at Marquette University. We have Eva Martina Paulus, and she is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at MATC. We have Vicki Turner, who's a project manager in student affairs at UWM. And we have Walter Lanier, who is the Director of Multicultural Affairs and Community Engagement at MATC. So we're really trying to span a number of the institutions of higher education here in the Milwaukee area and sort of varied and diverse work that touches on kind of the admissions to campus climate and student success to the community connections and beyond. To give a little bit of context to start, we wanted to provide some data and some statistics on some of the issues with access and inequality in the greater Milwaukee area. And so this first, point that we have here is just, I think, one that's stunning and is not something that's a surprise to folks who work in education in Wisconsin and Milwaukee, but it's something we need to talk about. And that's that the education gap between Wisconsin's Black and white students by some measures is one of the largest in the nation. And so what you see below that is a graph that we pulled from some data that's about the high school credential completion rate. So this is looking at high school completion. The yellow marker is that for Black students in Wisconsin. The sort of grayish one there is for Hispanic, and the pink one is for white. And so this is looking over a number of years at different rates, but you can see there it's consistently a quite wide gap, particularly between Black and white students. It's about sort of 71.5% of Black students and 84% of Latino students who have this high school credential in the 4-year rate in the 2020 cohort, and that's as compared to almost 95% of white students. Looking at some of the college completion rates and enrollment rates, so just taking one example of the UW system, which is a large one here in Wisconsin, 1 in 3 Latina students enrolled in college here will complete their degree within 6 years. 1 in 5 Black students, and that's as compared to 1 in 2 white students. So these inequities begin in sort of the lower education, these inequalities, but they carry through to higher education access, and then they also carry through to student success, completion, and where students go beyond. And so, this is something that is sort of in the background of our conversation today and what's really motivating it. And it's a question that has it's not a new question, I should say, right? And we'll talk a bit in a second about COVID-19 in particular and the ways that it's deepened these inequalities and these issues. But it's something that has been here in Wisconsin and the Milwaukee area in particular for quite a while. And there have been efforts to address it, but there's been little traction to be able to close these gaps and improve the higher education access, particularly for minoritized, low-income, first-generation populations. Talking a little bit about COVID-19, another thing, if you've been paying attention to the news, right, is that COVID-19 is having an impact on high school and post-secondary students, right? And these impacts are not equal either. And so here are just two examples of why these are not equal because of things that are affecting communities differently And these are more broad. These are beyond the context of Wisconsin and Milwaukee. These are at national level. But the first one on the left is just looking at Hispanic, Black, Asian, and white households and the number of hardships that they report during COVID-19. The purple bar there is Hispanic, the blue is Black, and then the sort of blackish gray bar is Asian, and the orange bar is white. And what you see is consistently that Hispanic and Black households report more hardships during this time. And so these are households, as you also mentioned as well, that have children, right? So these impacts on the household are going to impact in turn the child and the adolescent, and then these are students, and so it's going to impact their education. On the right, there's a graph there that is reporting the percentage of students with basic needs insecurities. And again, what you see is that for minoritized students, these rates are higher. And this is during COVID-19. So again, we're looking at incredibly high rates here, above 60%, for Black students, a little bit above 70%. And if we turn to sort of a state level and some more local data, we see things that are impacting FAFSA rates, college enrollment, right? So recently there have been articles that have been coming out, for instance, in the Journal Sentinel. There was a report recently from the Wisconsin Policy Forum highlighting that FAFSA rates for MPS students, which are predominantly, have a higher rate of Black or low-income students, the FAFSA completion rates are quite low, and they've decreased substantially during COVID-19. And so these impacts that we're seeing in these communities are translating as well to impacts on these students in terms of their thinking, planning, and preparing for higher education. And so that's just kind of a broad framework with some numbers to sort of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, which are these questions of higher education access and inequity, and particularly in relation to COVID-19 and the impacts that it's had. And so as I mentioned before, as I was introducing our panelists, we have quite a wide array of folks who are thinking both about the access into these institutions of higher education and then student success on them. And so we want to talk within this context about what are things that we are seeing in terms of challenges right now in particular, and then what are things that can be done and where we see hope and optimism. So with that in mind, I'm going to begin our conversation with these two questions that are going to guide the conversation. And so I will go panelist by panelist, asking them to answer each one of these. So I will start with the first one on top and ask each panelist to give their perspective on the question, and then we'll move to the second, and then we'll open it up a bit more broadly for a conversation. So the first question is given what we were just talking about in this sort of priming, what are priorities that you see to supporting underrepresented students' higher education access, particularly within the context of COVID-19's impacts? We are going to go one by one, as I mentioned, and so I will start by asking Alberto if he'd like to respond and comment and give his thoughts on that first question.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation this morning. I think, when I think of priorities for the type of support that we want to provide underrepresented students, the thing that sort of surfaced to the top and has been sort of the most prominent piece in providing access to students it's communication. Given the technology challenges, given the fact that students had to deal with so many levels of access, from Wi-Fi connectivity to the hardships of having to share spaces with siblings or whatnot, and also economical factors, right, that now are exacerbated by COVID and by the impact on their families. One thing that I like to highlight when we think about students, I look at through the lens of the entire family, because of the students that we serve, particularly Latinx students, which my office is charged in supporting. Many of them are the first one in their family to go to college. to be exact, over 60% of them are first one in their family. To that, you add the fact that a large percent of them, almost 85% of them, commute to campus on a normal year or academic year, and then you add to that the financial needs, which about 55% of them also have some sort of financial needs. So when you look at those three elements, those are the areas in which we focus. It's in really alleviating and providing the level of communication that is necessary for them to know where the money, the additional support, financial lives, how now that they have to operate from a place of virtual and access to technology. That's where we put our emphasis in making sure that students have options, have the resources to be able to do that, and that the family understands how to also best support that student in that process, because just like a first generation student has an information gap because no one before he or she attended, the parents also have now a huge challenge in being sort of the captains of those conversations at home, to be able to point those students in the direction of coming to college. So our emphasis from the standpoint of an educator, a practitioner, and providing access to students, it's been really involving the entire family in the process, and being able to provide the necessary communication and information to access those things that we already understood were challenges for these students, and really putting them, making them available in a way that they can really move forward in the process. So that, in my mind, are some of the things that we've been able to emphasize at the university level. It's we understand money is an issue, so let's create emergency funds. We know there is a technology challenge, so let's make sure that they know where to access those resources, and also how can we engage in different ways, whether it's through virtual access or any other routes that would allow for parents to feel more confident in supporting those students that are going to college for the first time.
Thank you, Alberto, for those comments. And I should have, again, when I passed along to you, reminded folks that Alberto is giving this perspective as director of the Roberto Hernandez Center and his work at UWM. So next, I'd like to sort of pass along to Brian, who is the director of undergraduate admissions at Marquette, to offer your thoughts on this first question.
I appreciate that, Gabriel, and appreciate the opportunity to join some very esteemed colleagues here. As Gabriel shared, I currently work at Marquette. I've been here a little more than 5 years, and before that was also at UW-Milwaukee, where I got to work alongside the wonderful Alberto. I really appreciate how this question and really this general topic has been framed, because we are wanting to prioritize this idea of access. So before I dive in, I wanted to share, in our office right now, we're, as I like to say, knee deep in reviewing applications right now. And a young person who submitted an application, and in their essay where they were disclosing some hardships they've had while in high school, kind of returning to high school during the pandemic, they wrote the following. They said, "I had very little practice of good judgment due to the fact I had not been to a school event in so long." And I think one of the things that always kind of strikes me as we have across higher education, we've all in our own way, I think, tried to extend grace in our policies and our procedures and how we communicate with students, as Alberto said, making ourselves available virtually, trying to engage the entire family in the process. No matter how we do this, at the end of the day, the young people who are going through navigating kind of the K through 12 experience, and then are looking ahead to this sort of what we like to describe as kind of a transformative, life-changing opportunity to go to college, it is important, I think, and something that I've just reflected on as we've been thinking about this discussion. We have to link this idea of access to what we mean in higher education by success, and to the extent that we can make our policies more accessible and get more applications and get students admitted to our institutions, I really don't even think that's half the battle. I think the real challenges we have and the priorities, as the question asks, that we have is how to connect access to meaningful success in the midst of a pandemic. And now at Marquette, as a Catholic and Jesuit university, we use this Latin phrase, cura personalis, or care for the whole person, to inform kind of how we approach everything from teaching to co-educational opportunities, to co-curricular opportunities, to how we do our work in admissions. And so we tell students, we care for you, mind, body, and spirit. We care about your mental health. We care about your development, both inside and outside the classroom. But one of the things I think that is really important for us and a priority for any of us is helping young people who are navigating this often very stressful, sometimes overwhelming process of applying to a college, figuring out where they will spend the next 2 or the next 4 years of their lives, is to paint a picture of how we define success and what we are going to do to invest in their success as an institution. So much of the college access conversation, I think, is driven by what students have to achieve in order to gain that access. And I think instead, what we as practitioners spend a lot of our time and energy doing is trying to reframe that for students and say, you need to expect that we will bring some things to the table as well. Now we need to find out what those are so we can meet students where they are. So we can say, for example, that we want to move our first to second year retention rate from 89 to 94%. This is part of our current strategic plan at Marquette. But we need to be thoughtful and intentional about the fact that our population has changed in very positive and meaningful ways. In my 5 years here at Marquette, I've seen as we have more first-generation college students in our freshman class than we do legacy students who have siblings or parents or grandparents who attended the institution. So we have to perhaps change how we have conversations with students and with families about what they can expect at Marquette and how we will be investing in their experience as college students. So that's really, I think, my general comment to kind of start off, and I'm looking forward to the other question as well and to hearing from the other panelists, is just that really important priority of linking at the institutional level and in support of students, linking the concept of access with the concept of success. I'll turn it back to you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Brian, for those thoughts. I will pass it along now to Eva. Eva is working on diversity, equity, and inclusion at MATC, so it's Milwaukee Area Technical College, and ask her to offer her thoughts in the work that she does there in relation to this question about priorities for access of underrepresented students.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Velez. Again, Eva Martinez-Paules, my pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. And I will have to start by saying that we need to first understand that our students are going through a lot. In the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of the racial injustices that have also impacted our students and their way of life. We saw the economic disparities that the pandemic has brought on into many of our families and families of color in particular. And then we have the added dimensions of the actual pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. I would have to say that from my view as a Chief Diversity Officer at MATC, in terms of access, I look at it this way. We have to truly and authentically work on our structures and systems. If we want to be accessible to our students, our Black and Brown students, or Indigenous students and diverse student populations, we need to really start building, rebuilding, and also dismantling some of the systems that have been in place for many years that have prevented access and that have also prevented our student success, particularly the success of Black and Brown students. One of the strategies for me as the CDO at MATC is to work very closely with our senior leaders to really think through of the experiences and the stories and the difficulties and struggles that our students are going through and how our current systems are perpetrating those inequities in student success. I always say that it's really great to have really awesome strategies for access to higher education, but if we don't have the support systems in place, once our students get to higher ed, to our institutions, the question still remains. So is it still worth it to revamp those policies and those procedures, and then we see them and our students are still struggling? So I always think about ways that we can continue to improve the systems and the structures and the policies and the procedures that are preventing our students to access higher ed, that are preventing our students or Black and Brown students from being retained and succeeding holistically at our colleges and universities in Wisconsin and across the nation. I would also say that focusing on the financial supports that we provide our students, not only as they come in and the financial aid support that they get as they apply to colleges and universities, but also thinking critically about how we are going to sustain that financial support throughout the students' journey in higher education. So financial support and FAFSA and awareness of that. Also, the third priority that I would think about is also supporting our wellness and mental health support systems for our students. We know that after the pandemic, we are not the same anymore. Things have changed drastically. So we need to be able to center the students' holistic success in terms of wellness and mental health and providing those services to our students. So financial aid, really improving our systems and our structures so that all students can succeed, and also improving our financial aid supports. The second question with what gives me hope despite some of these challenges, what I'm seeing is that I'm seeing a great coalition of allies, a great coalition of individuals across the nation coming together to really solve the DEI issues that we face. That gives me hope. What gives me hope is this panel, the presenters of this panel, your commitment to access and student success, your commitment to challenging us every single day and thinking outside the box of what else can we do for our students. What gives me hope is that we have really great momentum when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the access and success of our Black and Brown students, and we don't want to lose that. We want to make sure that we continue making the improvements that we need to improve in terms of structure and systems. So that gives me hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. And we'll return to that second question too and get some of the other panelists' thoughts after this first round. I do want to say, just from my perspective, I am hearing some common themes, and I will pass it along to Vicki Turner and to Walter Lanier in a second, but just to kind of highlight this discussion about, the question is asking about access, but I'm hearing, these discussions and talking about it being so much more, right? It's about family context, it's about retention, it's about systems, it's about structures. And so it really is much more complex than just maybe a narrow focus on access. But with that, I would like to pass it along. Seems that our next in our line as one of our speakers is Vicki Turner. And Vicki works with student affairs. She's a project manager at UWM, but does some other work as well on programs that are really focused in this area. And so I'd like to ask her to offer her thoughts on the first question about priorities to supporting underrepresented students.
Great. Thank you so much. And, I, like the other panelists, I'm pleased to be here and to have the focus on this topic. This is so important, and it's the kind of thing that we need to make sure we're paying attention to. So as Gabriel said, I am at UWM, and the thing that I am going to talk about are two partnerships that I'm involved with. One is called MCube, and this is a partnership between Milwaukee Public Schools, Milwaukee Area Technical College, and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. If you look at those three urban institutions in Milwaukee, collectively serving over 100,000 students, Our leaders formed a coalition of the three of us working together. It was about 5 years ago, and the mission is not small, but it's to transform Milwaukee through education. So this is a focus on how we can work together. And the reason I mention partnerships, and this one in particular, is that through partnerships, you often uncover what we refer to as the cracks that people fall into as they're moving between places and institutions. You know, sometimes within a single institution, we have some information about our students, but we don't always know what those connection points are. And partnerships really help you address those. We've done, we have found out that a lot of we'll say the English language preparation, when we speak with the high school teachers, is based upon really the literature approach, and that it's missing perhaps some of what the post-secondary is requiring with we'll say the composition and readiness. And so in those small ways, we can really disenfranchise students making transitions. So I'm just saying that the partnership is a really important avenue by which to connect with all of our students, and especially those who we have as our highest priority to serve. This is our BIPOC student population, and as has been discussed so far, tremendously impacted by COVID-19. The problems were all there before, but COVID-19 made it harder. And so this is the thing that we want to make sure we are not creating additional barriers when we have the power to change that. The other partnership that I work with is called the Higher Education Regional Alliance. And this is a coalition of 18 higher ed institutions in southeastern Wisconsin. So it's the three UW, 3 technical college, and an additional 12 private institutions were formed 3 years ago with the intention of how can we improve outcomes, how can we be more innovative for our region, the 7 counties of southeastern Wisconsin, and how can we better connect with the employers. So that partnership took on a pretty significant equity challenge. So my other sort of priority is an equity lens in what we're doing. And many people are familiar with EAB. It's a technology company that provides a lot of software for higher ed to track, we'll say, student success and all components of student activity. EAB put out a challenge that they called Moonshot for Equity. And that Moonshot for Equity challenge really said, look, 50 years ago, we were able to launch a man and put that man on the moon. And here, 50 years later, we have equity gaps in higher ed. Why is that? And so, you don't often think of a private company as being the lead in, for, we'll say, providing resources, but they committed $25 million to help 7 regions across the country address equity issues. And so they chose the Milwaukee region a year ago. There are 4 institutions specifically that signed the contract to be the Moonshot for Equity partners. That includes UW Parkside, it includes UWM, MATC, and Carthage. So it's a cross-institutional kind of partnership. But beyond that, because everyone is part of the HERA, this is the HERA project, everyone is benefiting. So Marquette, all of the other institutions in the region, we're working to share best practices. So I'm going to share one that we have had some experience with, and how saying that we need to look at things with the equity lens. Several of the panelists mentioned that we have a lot that we can control. So one of the things that EAB has asked the institutions to go through, there are 15 best practices, and I know that's going to be, we'll share that with you following this webinar, that you can have the information. But we know that we need to work on things like, having leadership, believe in equity. We know that there are training opportunities that we can use, but we often don't think about the impacts of some of our academic policies. And this is pretty, we'll say it's not the highest level thing, but we looked at hold reform. And so I'm just going to give you a quick summary of what we found. I'll name UWM first, but when we looked at the holds, that is the either financial or administrative holds that prevent the students we have from registering for classes, we found that 34%, while BIPOC students represent 34% of UWM's overall campus population, it represented 46.7% of the population with a financial hold. And this was pretty universal. All the institutions that looked at this realized that the kind of thing that we do administratively were tripping us up. And so this is just another approach. How can we look at things with an equity lens, even if it's, I don't want to say as simple because it's a complex thing, but even if it's as simple as hold reform. So I leave you with those two comments about partnerships and an equity lens. And I know we have a chance to talk more. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. And to follow up, as she mentioned, we will be sharing some resources both at the end of this and then in follow-up. And one of those includes the website Tahara, which is a great resource for data as well. And I know there have been a couple questions maybe coming in around more specifics of the data and data on these topics. And so that's a good place to access some of that. I'll also quickly speak to the partnerships point because some of the work that I do in my role here and as faculty director of what we call the Blessed Hub, which is really a partnership between Marquette, MATC, and some other folks, including UWM is a big part of this, is trying to look at those transitions, the transitions from high school to post-secondary to employment, from post-secondary to post-secondary as well, from a place like MATC to UWM or Marquette. And there's a lot of data that those transitions, again, pre-COVID are a place where a lot of students become lost or face new challenges and obstacles. And so as Vicki was mentioning, those partnerships and connections and fluidity across those is one way to sort of strengthen this and one of the priorities. And I sort of mentioned that because I know our next speaker, Walter Lanier, that is a priority that he has identified and driven. And he's one of the visionaries behind the Blessed Hub work that I just mentioned. And so with that, I will hand it off to Walter. And Walter's role is with Milwaukee Area Technical College. Walter is the Director of Multicultural Affairs and Community Engagement, as well as involved in another number of other efforts and initiatives across the Milwaukee area. So Walter, if you could give us your thoughts on the first question.
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel, and I certainly count it as an honor and a privilege to serve alongside my esteemed colleagues, and in particular Alberto, because we just saw each other this morning at UWM, where I'm an alumni, for a Boys and Men of Color breakfast that we had to round out Boys and Men of Color Month here in Milwaukee. It was excellent to see the rich diversity in the room of Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, Hispanic, Hmong in the room. Very dynamic, and I think it was representative of the potential that we have inside our collective ecosystem. My background, just briefly, UWM undergrad. I work now at MATC with a new role, Gabe, so I'll tell you what that is in a minute. On the board of Marquette Center for Urban Research, Teaching, and Outreach. And as Gabe mentioned, one of the lead visionaries, he said, I'll take it, of the Black and Latino dual enrollment and transfer hub, which is really about access. And then I even have taken one class at UW-Madison. So I've touched almost, many institutions here in our area around education. I want to start out by saying, because we're talking about underrepresented and I'll say under-resourced students in higher education in COVID-19. And I would say, first of all, that we must acknowledge and digest that what COVID-19 impact has been it has been both a revealer on and shined a light on things that we should have known better. It revealed systemic gaps, equity gaps, shined a light on systemic gaps and equity gaps that the collective we, the professionals in the educational ecosystem, should have been addressing sooner, should have known better. They have emerged. And so my hope, I'll just say this, we'll deal with it in more detail when you get to the question, Gabe, is that we will take a more serious and intentional look at equity inside our collective ecosystem, because if we had done, now getting to priorities, which is centering students in general and students of color in particular, we could have talked to students and students of color in particular. They would have told us about the gaps. They would have told us what was going to occur. They would have told us about the policies and the procedures are, and chances are, if we dig deeply enough, we'll find out that they have told us in what we have called anecdotes, but what we failed to capture systemically. And so my second bullet point, in addition to that broad one of centering student voice and students of color, is that we're dealing with systemic issues. This is we're in our 2020s, and we're talking about this. It was the 2010s we could have been talking about this. When we entered into the 21st century, we could be talking about this same thing. COVID just elevated the conversation, but they're not new conversations. And one of our challenges is that we have dealt with these things programmatically, anecdotally, have dealt with them as good deeds, which are good to do, but seldom have we dealt with them systemically and said, what do we need to do with our systems? And how do we need to engage students in our systems to understand how our systems and processes, as Eva has said, are doing harm and have been doing harm for years. Our students would tell us. Our staff of color would tell us. Our communities of color would tell us. All we would have to do is ask and then get that information systemically, and we would know. And the troops on the ground, because we are higher education and we're a little bit siloed, maybe a lot of bit siloed, and certainly hierarchical. If we touch the ground, speaking to what Alberto was saying, of our respective communities, talk to the staff on the ground and the students on the ground, we would find that we had this information available for us. The next bullet point I'd say is to be intentional on race and the engagement of student voice. It's one thing to do it, as often happens, towards the end of conversations, towards the end of meetings, towards the end of initiatives, and say, oh, wait, we've got to get the student voice. Oh, wait, we've got to engage the community, but have that there at the very beginning. That's real integrity to student voice. That's real integrity to race and closing equity gaps. Brian, I appreciate what you said about grace on policies. I'll say, I include myself in the number. This means, again, we're late because it's 2020. If we had spoken to students of color, staff of color, troops on the ground, communities, we would know how many of our policies and procedures do harm to students. It's unfortunate for probably all of our institutions that there is not more what we call grace built into the policies and procedures, but really I would call it what is needed in a healthy community. The next thing is being real about our demographics and serving the students that we have, not the students that we had. And we have that data. One thing about higher education is we're rich in data. We do not always use it as effectively as we should and in a systemic way. Closing equity gaps, dealing with these impacts are systemic issues. We need to treat them that way, not as programmatic issues. There are best practices that have existed for a long time. There are practitioners all over the country that can provide templates and ways to do it where we have the commitment to do so. Next, I will say budgets, 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 budgets. Did I mention budgets? Because the best reflection, in addition to what is put on paper as stated values for an institution, is put our money where our mouths are. And how do our budgets reflect our commitment to student voice, centering student voice, and closing equity gaps? I would have a guess that if we gave ourselves a grade and looked at our budgets to see what the percentages were like, we would not do well. And so it's not easy to do that, but then it depends on what is the real commitment to change. If there are other things that we want to move, we commit dollars and real budget dollars over time to move it. This is one of our most challenging and perplexing challenges, closing equity gaps. It can be done, but if we don't commit resources to it the way we commit resources to other things, that's just it's not realistic. And it also tells a story. It also tells a narrative. We need to know that we work with savvy communities, emotionally intelligent communities. Communities know when they're under-resourced. Students know when they're under-resourced and underserved and what the budgets look like. They know when it's crumbs relative to, say, facilities, for example. Last thing I'll say is about access in particular is introducing students to the system sooner. I know we all have some commitments to that, both through MCube, other initiatives. I obviously like the project that we have working on through the Black and Latino dual enrollment and transfer hub. Even in those specific spots, when we talk about access by way of transfer amongst these institutions or dual enrollment from high school to college, there are equity gaps in those two great access points. Those are great access points. Introduce students to other institutions sooner, so there's a familiarity with the what's available in the ecosystem. And so those are real two specific points. I like the work we're doing. We look forward to growing in collaboration to closing equity gaps around dual enrollment and transfer. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Walter. And I know I'm sure panelists have a lot of thoughts. I want us to sort of move through the second question so we can also engage, but just offer one other common thread I'm hearing is this one about money, right? And it comes through in financial aid. It comes through in resources for these families and communities as well. So looking beyond just the sort of educational sector, the resources that we're providing as a society for families and communities that are hit hard by COVID-19, that are the ones where these students are coming from. And then also to Walter's point about budgets. So at the institutions, the budget's reflecting these kind of priorities that we've talked about. With that, let's kind of move on to a positive point with a hope, and then we'll engage with each other. So, I think it's always good to try and take some of the strength focus, not looking just at deficit frameworks. And so I'm excited to hear what our panelists have to say. And Alberto, I'll hand it off to you first for what gives you hope.
Oh, what gives me hope? I think some of the things have been mentioned already, but I think collaboration is a word that comes to mind. I think, if anything, we are coming together more often than none. If you would ask me 10 years ago, what gives me hope, I would have had, a little bit of trouble coming up with some suggestions. But, across the region, this panel it's a clear example of that collaborative work. I'm part of the Hispanic Serving Institution Network of Wisconsin. There's about 9 or 10 institutions who are committed to improve the conditions on serving Latinx students in their institutions. And that conversation would have never happened 10, 15 years ago. It's happening now. So that gives me hope that we are, talking across institutions and saying, what's working for me, why don't you try it? This is a challenge that I'm having right now. Why don't we collaborate? And so those are things that are really amplifies how much territory we can cover, how many families and students in our community we can serve with intention. Intentionality, it's another word that I would like to use. I think we have become more intentional than ever, and not having to work necessarily in silos, but institutionalizing this intentionality, having folks from different parts of our campuses really thinking through the lens of equity and anti-racist approaches to serving students and really providing access to students. So intentionality, the collaborative spirit that gives me hope. And I have to put students at the center of hope. Having been able to interact with students for the first time in the last 18 months and hearing firsthand from them how much they really want to be in college, how much they want to be in community, and then coupling that with what our campuses are collectively doing to really set themselves up for the needs that have been sort of exacerbated by COVID. It's good. It's good to see, and I think Eva said it well earlier. You know, allies. You know, I think the word allies has taken a new meaning, right? Not only because we are acting as a community of allies for our students, but because there's more of us, and we've really done a good job collectively to bring more people on board, to bring more people that perhaps don't look like us or like the students we serve, to really understand the needs, the equity gaps, but to also, like Walter said, to walk the talk, you know, not just put a sign in the front window of their office and say, I'm an ally, but act on the services that are very much needed for the students, you know, and for their academic success.
Thank you, Alberto, for those thoughts, and I'll hand it over to Brian next for what gives you hope.
Yeah, I'll try to keep mine short and sweet. The students we work with every day give me hope. This is, I think, for all of us on this panel, at some level, we were drawn to this work because of our appreciation for, our respect for, our inspiration by students. I have two quick examples I want to share at Marquette. I think these will really connect with some work that other folks on the panel are doing. One example would be the expansion early last year, of Marquette's Urban Scholars Program. It's 5 full tuition scholarships that we used to give, specifically working with partner organizations like the Boys and Girls Club, clubs across America, but really with a focus on Black and Brown students here in the greater Milwaukee area as well. And at the beginning of the last academic year, so rewind to August and September of 2020, it was Marquette students who gave voice to the racial injustices that had taken place over the summer and challenged our institution to do more, and in many ways put their money where their mouth was, so to speak. And that 5 full tuition scholarship program expanded in 1 year to 45 full tuition, and in some cases room and board scholarships for students. And one of the things, and Walter, I really appreciate what you shared, because I think one of the things that had to happen early and often, it wasn't an afterthought at the end of a meeting in this case. It was us in admissions working with the Urban Scholars Program, working with senior leadership to say, we will not move forward in the development of what you've promised without bringing the students who advocated for these scholarships to the table, and to lead this effort to talk about what this should look like, how it should get operationalized. And we had a tremendous success. And so you could imagine, from an admissions person's perspective, to see, you know, the applicant pool for a really prestigious and fantastic opportunity to address, as we've heard some of the thread today, some of the financial concerns. To have a full tuition scholarship anywhere is phenomenal, and to go then from 5 to 45 is a significant feat. And so for me to see, you know, typically we get, you know, 50 to 100 applications for 5 spots, and all of a sudden we have 450, 500 applications for these spaces. What that tells me is that we've been doing it wrong all along, right? And by putting students at the center, not only of the advocacy, but then in the recruitment of, the participation in, the engagement in that process, because frankly, the incoming students, to achieve that success we talked about earlier, they're going to need students, people who have walked in their shoes before they did, who can help guide them along the way. And sure, our faculty and staff are eager to lend that support too. But you asked me what gives me hope. It's our current students. So I know in the interest of time, I'll stop there, but really appreciate the opportunity to speak to, you know, and hear so many examples of why we should have hope in this work that we do.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. I want to, before we go to the next speaker, I want to interject one thing that's just related to a question I know that came up, and that was about sort of intersectionalities. And there's a particular question that was asking about students who maybe have very sort of gender or sexual identities. And so, you know, this question, we've been talking about these as kind of large groups and often referring to underrepresented. But I wanted to build on that to say, like, one of the things for me with the students is how the students can really, for me as a faculty member, but also I think at an institutional level, they're driving consideration of these intersectional questions, right? And so, you know, often on our campuses, I think students are helping us understand where we're creating homogeneous categories that we need to be looking at deeper. And this speaks to what Vicky was talking about with institutional data, but also what Walter was talking about with the need to be attentive to student voice. And so I kind of want to put that issue out there. We can come back to that later too, because I think that's an important question and an important thing to integrate into this discussion. But continuing along with this question of hope, Eva, I wanted to ask if I know you mentioned a little bit about what gives you hope before, but if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yes, thank you. Are you asking me, right, Dr. Velez? Okay, thank you so much. What gives me hope is also what's challenging. The needs of our communities is what gives me hope that we're able to see 10, 20 years from now, and we have a vision, and I'm talking specifically about this panel right here. If you hear it from all of us, there's this vision that we are using our life's purpose, if you will, for change, for moving equity forward. And that gives me hope, right? Along with our students give me hope. So when we have those challenging moments, thinking about the stories and the people that we are touching and impacting, that's what gives me hope. But also what gives me hope is the notion that we, people of color and our allies in our other diverse communities, we are moving from diversity, equity, and inclusion to the notion of what's right and what's just. The notion of justice in DEI and the notion of doing what is right to close those equity gaps. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you for giving me that space.
Thank you. And I'll pass along to Vicky for the second question about what gives hope.
Yes, there is a lot of hope. I wanted to just share a MCube example. People who work in the space of dual enrollment know that some institutions or programs require a pretty high GPA in order for students to participate in a dual enrollment program. You know, MCube took the approach that we're not going to do that. We're going to look at other indicators like attendance and, you know, and we're going to have more students participate. So we opened it up and we had students take the same courses that previously required, you know, 3.5 GPA. And guess what? They succeeded. They succeeded even though their GPAs were not 3.5. They succeeded because we, you know, stopped putting in place, we'll say, false barriers for students. And so, and we also listened to them and we heard where they needed support and what they needed, and we provided that. And so the students are what give me hope because they succeed. The other thing that gives me hope is that as institutions, we sometimes feel we can't change very quickly, and we know the issues we deal with are complex. But I'm going to say that we can break things down into manageable parts. You know, as simple as the hold reform can be, we at UWM removed 38 holds. We reformed 74. And as a result of the work that was done, 500 additional students were able to enroll. It's like we can have an impact right now. And so I'm going to leave you with a Star Wars quote from Yoda that he said to Luke Skywalker, "No try, do." So I'm going to say to you, you know, no try, do.
I think that's a great point. I mean, and part of this hope, right, is these actions that are being taken, you know, a lot of things we've referred to and that is being doing, not just trying. Walter, if you want to wrap things up for us on that last question, and then we'll kind of open it up to more of a conversation.
Yeah, what gives me hope? Several things. I think that there is, I believe in organized people. I know that part of the push to increase scholarships at Marquette came from some students exercising their righteous voice and coming together and making demands on the system. And so I like that push from the bottom, if you will, although it shouldn't be the bottom, but it is from the ground, I'll say it that way. And we're seeing more of that. I have hope for the city, really, because we're seeing more of that type of organization and advocacy and voices becoming more effective at advocating inside our institutions and otherwise. Certainly, the increased push for equity that has come about, one, as a result of the pandemic, also as a result of the murder of George Floyd and protest. And so, you know, historically, sadly, that's what it's taken: protest, pain, and even death for change. But the change has come nonetheless. The third thing, I think, people, I'm looking at our panel. So we're in mid-leadership, and I'm seeing, you know, except for our chief diversity officer, she's a senior leader now. But I'm seeing more people in the practitioner category, let me say it that way, speaking up more in institutions, collaborating and organizing and advocating. And lastly, and not in any particular order, I'm seeing more people in positions of power. So with titles and positions of power, more willingness than I have seen in the past to acknowledge what they don't know and to receive instructions, suggestions, directions from those who do. So I see that combination of things as a rich opportunity for change. And of course, I think history is on our side. That's it.
Thank you, Walter. And I do want to open it up to, so we have, you know, around a little under 20 minutes left. There's an audience question I do want to return to in a second, but I first wanted to give a chance for anyone amongst our panelists to respond directly to something another said, or we've kind of been building off each other as we go, but just kind of give a space for if there's any feedback from each other or direct questions or engagement before I bring in some of these audience questions.
I'll just say briefly, I was really encouraged by what everybody said in terms of some specific actions I put in the chat. Just the Urban Scholars Program 5 to 45, that was worthy of some applause. Took some time, as Eva said, but that shows systemic change. And then Vicki Turner, when you talked about the dual enrollment policy change, that's just a great example of systemic policy harm, whether it is through benign neglect or intentionality, usually more the former than the latter. It still does harm. So I thought those are really two great systemic changes.
So not to move from the positive and talking about these hopes and good things to some more of the challenges, to return to that. But one of the things we haven't really touched on a lot in our conversation that I think is important to bring into this is the question of mental health. And, you know, I appreciate one of our audience members raised a question, and they cited in particular a study from the Trevor Project that was in relation to queer college students and talking about their higher rates of mental health concerns. And that was sort of what I was referencing before with the question of intersectionality as well. But I was wondering, you know, if we could maybe talk broadly about, you know, the ways we've seen mental health questions and issues rise in terms of these challenges to access and success, but then also the types of things that are being done to address that. And if you think that those are responsive to the needs that we're seeing from students. And I don't necessarily want to put you on the spot, but Walter, I know some of your work directly intersects with the questions of mental health. And so I was wondering if you might want to take a first sort of response to that, and then we can open up to anyone else who wants to speak to the question of mental health.
Yeah, so I'll strive to be brief. So in between the time we pulled this, I think began pulling this together, and now I'm in a different seat. I'm the Director of Student Resources and also our Counseling and Psychological Services Department, which is new. It's small, but it reflects a growing commitment from the college to provide mental health resources to students. So we currently have 4 licensed professional counselors, hoping to grow that to 6 and then 12. That's my hope. And then before that, I was the Director of Counseling, Advising, and Career Planning. So I would say the mental health issue is a subset of the equity issue. If we know our students well, if we identify their needs, their gaps, then this is something that we will put in place either with direct resources or making connections with the mental health community. Mental health resources, I know from some other work I do, I sit on the Milwaukee County Mental Health Board, exist, but they're not easy to access. They're also not easy to articulate. It's not that, it's probably a more challenging system to access than ours is sometimes. And so it needs to be made plain and transparent. There's also a big stigma piece around, and I think maybe that's where I would actually enter into to answer your question, Gabe, around issues of mental health diagnoses. And so if I was to wave a small size magic wand over all of our institutions, it would be to doing a campaign around raising awareness, because people can have resources but not access them for shame or stigma. And then the last thread I want to connect to that is this is connected to the previous issue, because in college cultures that are not healthy or that might have some toxicity in them relative to students of color, that can be a mental health issue of first resort. If I'm dealing with policies and procedures, and we see this in our institutions, especially if you're on the ground working with students, a lot of their concerns and angst are about some of our own procedures that they've bumped up against, that they don't understand, that where they feel they've been treated transparently, unfairly. And so the nature of the culture of the institution relative to students, I would say, is actually job one around mental health, in addition to the connection to resources, because that culture can make a big difference one way or another.
Dr. Velez, can I make a quick comment?
Go ahead, Eva.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to make a quick comment related to the question that you asked in terms of addressing barriers and concerns for queer people of color. I think that there are still many systemic issues that we need to address to improve wellness and mental health services for our queer students, specifically for queer students of color. For example, I think many institutions, some of them are pretty ahead of the curve, but many of us are still in that space where we need to juggle those policies and procedures related to preferred names, related to pronouns, related to bias, stigma, and stereotype for queer students in the classroom and outside of the classroom, which relates to our culture as well. But then also gender neutral bathrooms, and how do we remove those systemic barriers that are preventing our queer and transgender students of color from succeeding. I think that before the pandemic, the LGBTQ+ community was dealing with many mental health issues, and that pandemic has actually exacerbated those issues. So this particular community is something very dear to my heart as an individual that has been completely immersed in the community and having ran and co-founded an LGBTQ+ resource center. We still need to make major and significant changes with the community, particularly in the classroom. There are concerns of bias and stigma throughout higher education, and we need to pay attention to this population and be advocates for systemic change. So thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a great point. One of the things I keep hearing throughout this is the thinking about the types of supports and resources we need to provide individual students, right? So sometimes that may be counseling for needs. Sometimes that may be guidance to something like FAFSA. Sometimes that may be, as Alberto mentioned early on in relation to COVID, emergency loans or technology support. And then, there's this continuing in the background systemic structural change that needs to happen. We need to be changing the environments and the systems and the policies, because otherwise we're not going to be able to really shift things. And so there's it's happening on these multiple levels to me, because we can't ignore the direct student needs right now. And so if we said we're only going to focus on the systemic and the policies, we're leaving students in the current systems and environments unsupported, and they get lost in the cracks, and they're facing these increased challenges during COVID. But if we are only providing the programs, the counseling, the individualized support, then we're not addressing these larger issues that also extend beyond our institutions, right? I mean, some of these issues and some of the work that we've been doing, and Walter mentioned, thinking of this as an ecosystem, right? Particularly in the Milwaukee area, speaks to the histories of segregation, the histories of, housing inequality, educational issues and inequality. But then also even to what Eva just said, I mean, some of the questions facing, for instance, our queer students of color are beyond some of them are environmental, and some are recognizing the challenges that they're facing as queer people of color in the broader society. And we can't just ignore that what they're facing on our campus is also tied into larger systems and structures that we also need to be actively combating and providing support and resources to sort of handle. So that's some of what I'm sort of seeing from all that we're talking about. We still have a few minutes, and so I do want to continue to sort of have this discussion. If there are any other questions that folks have out there in the audience, please feel free to put them in the chat and they will be passed along. I also did want to raise again, though, coming back to kind of this question of intersectionality and more broadly, how do you see addressing some of these questions and issues when on some level they can look so different for students that are coming from different backgrounds? And so, again, the first question we asked before was about underrepresented students. And that is, such a large bucket. And so, someone raised the first question that was asking, I think, in relation to students who are Asian. And then, second question was intersectionality in relation to gender and sexual identity. But how do we think about the ways that needs can be so diverse based on students' identities, positionalities, how they're, where they live in the city, geography, if they're coming from Milwaukee. And so how can we sort of address that wide range? What do we need to be doing? And maybe some of this speaks to, too, how can we be incorporating the student voice effectively? That also was mentioned earlier.
I think something that's important for us to recognize and to identify is that we need to heal, right? That collectively we've gone at all levels in different communities through a lot of trauma, right? Whether it was, exacerbated by COVID, dealing with mental health issues, dealing with financial burdens, you name it, right? We can go down the list of different things that has impacted many communities, but I think being able to identify that and to talk about healing in a way that sort of brings folks together, because healing not only for our students, but healing for us as practitioners too, right? We often remove ourselves from the equation, but we need to bring ourselves back because we also are humans. So something that I'm very proud to be part of and that we sort of instituted here at UWM is not only we engage in that conversation about healing, but what does that mean, and to whom we need to create spaces to allow for that healing to take place. So we developed a trauma-informed kit and training that we're sharing with all parts of campus at all levels, so we can be tooled up and equipped with the things that are necessary for us to not only hear personally, but to also be prepared to provide students with quality care, right? And identify when the student needs to be resourced and to be pointed in a direction where that person can heal and be successful. I put in the chat, I'll share a toolkit that we developed on campus. Please share it among yourselves and with others. You know, understanding and recognizing that we also have trauma, right? That all of us, and how do we react? How do we create the conditions for us to mitigate some of that? How to deal with it? It's super important.
I just wanted to add to that. You know, we sometimes address a lot of the things that take place in a pretty narrow response, but you know, our students are whole individuals, and so to the degree that we can be more holistic in our approach and to cross over, we'll say, systems and you know, different information sources where we interact with students, so that we can have this more coordinated effort is beneficial, you know. And I started out talking about partnerships, some outside our institutions, but it's almost, there's a need for partnerships inside our own institutions to have this more holistic support and coordinated care. And so, and I think that's how we're able to acknowledge and then resource and support these, you know, the issues that students and really all of us are facing. So I feel like that's another lens that we can add to how we are thinking about what we can do.
I appreciate these last two comments about the trauma that are faced more broadly. And that ties into one question that was just raised about, you know, students who are BIPOC, but are maybe not first generation, or maybe are coming from families that have a little bit different resources, but they are still, like many of us too, you know, they're coming from communities of trauma. Their backgrounds are sort of the experiences during COVID that a lot of us have faced, but have been disproportionately impacting these communities. We only have a couple minutes, but I do want to pass along to Eva really quick to address a question that was raised about changing systems of mental health care provision, because sometimes those systems are problematic on college campuses.
Yes, so one of the practices that we are currently implementing, specifically with our BIPOC LGBTQ identified community, is that we have an employee affinity group, an LGBTQ plus and allies, that has been working very closely with me as the Chief Diversity Equity Officer at MATC and other committees to provide voice to the needs, to the resources that we need within that population, and also to make systemic changes as well. Also, best practices show that if you offer a safe zone and safe spaces for different populations, that works very well and is best practice across higher ed. Also having dedicated staff that can also be communicating effectively with senior leaders. And I think that sometimes what we see in higher ed is that lack of communication between our staff that are supporting the different populations and communities and the decisions that are being made. So continuing to have that dialogue and conversation. I would also have to say that partnerships work very well when it comes to BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities. Making sure that our students are not only connected to the resources that we have at the institution, but also connecting them to external partners that can also offer additional resources. But I think that in terms of this particular communities, we need to continue to highlight the issues, push those issues forward, and making sure that our senior leaders are completely aware of what the needs of those communities are. So that way, when we are making decisions, that we are taking that in consideration. That's why it's so important that in the decision-making process that we have different lenses, voices, and perspective in the conversation before decisions are made. So those are some of the strategies that I would recommend. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you. And there's so much more that I know we probably all want to say and talk about. They only have about 30 seconds. Two things I just want to highlight in relation to some of these questions are coming up. One is representation. And I think when I mentioned representation, I mean it, when we're talking about mental health care, and who are the counselors? When we're talking about admissions, I know this is something Brian and I at Marquette have talked about, having representatives from these types of communities being on those staff so that the students are seeing folks like them there, but also these kind of voices and perspectives are being drawn attention to. And then tied into this, I think, is whenever we ask for student voice or people to represent, or in some way we want to be inclusive, we also need to be thinking about action and change. And a lot of the discussion, I think, today is revolved around that, which I appreciate, because one of the things I often hear from our students at Marquette is I've been asked to give my input, or I fill out a campus climate survey, but I don't see change. I don't see action on that. And, I think a lot of our conversation today has been focused on concrete actions and concrete things that are being done. And I think that's important in this kind of question, no matter what we're dealing with, what student population is. We're not just asking them to voice or giving them space for their voice, but then actually acting on that. So I know we do have to wrap up now, and I've put my own email and contact here. And if you want to be in touch with any of the panelists, we are going to be following up with all of their contact information and some other information from some of the projects we all work on in a one-pager. Thank you all for the audience who's out there, and thank you to my panelists. I wish we could have 3-4 hours for this conversation, and to all the folks at UW for their support in putting this all together. So have a great rest of the forum, and please be in touch and reach out. We'd love to talk with you all and hear from you more about your thoughts.